Hey y'all, welcome to this episode of Design Thinking at Work. I'm Kate Casey, and we're just going to jump on in. I had the pleasure of speaking with illustrator and educator Dylan Hale. Mr. Hale currently occupies two different roles. He works for Bentonville Public Schools, specifically the virtual school program. He sees secondary kids, so 7th through 12th grade, through his art, visual art, and art appreciation classes. He is also an illustrator working primarily with children book authors and our very own Dr. Connors. I was actually able to be extremely selfish during this interview because I could really pick through Mr. Hale's mind, tapping into both his illustrator and educator role, focusing largely on the literacy he interacts with as an illustrator, but also how there is very clear overlap between artistic literacy and the traditional literacy of education. So, to give you a little bit of background on Mr. Hale, you may actually see some of your own students in his artistic upbringing, but as a kid, he had a real love of drawing and art that his parents really fostered in him, which I think is amazing. I often see my own students with this creative side that think of it very much in isolation, something that was only a hobby, but he was able to really grow into it. He described himself as someone who seized every artistic opportunity that came his way, mentioning he worked at Rick's Bakery decorating cakes in Fayetteville, and eventually did the glittered ceiling you can see at the Rogers location, which, if you haven't tried any of their baked goods, I 100% recommend. But in a more formal sense, he had classical art training through his college classes at the University of Arkansas. Woo pig suey. What is really neat is that he shared a lot of his work, posting the cakes that he decorated or the art that he designed for his class, which is what seemed to lead to this opportunity presented to him by a friend who reached out to see if he would want to be associated with a publishing company and do the illustration for children's books or anything else that kind of came his way. What I found most interesting in my conversation with Mr. Hale is this visual language that he referred to multiple times throughout our interview. And I actually had him clarify it for me just so I could better follow his train of thought. But ultimately, this visual language that he navigates refers to things such as patterns, color palettes, lines, texture, scale, and so on. Kind of the things that you tend to associate with art or visual creations of any kind. But what was most interesting and something that we actually discussed is the semiotic representation these elements communicate with a viewer or a reader. He has to consider all of these things as he is creating or building these images around the stories created by our authors. So he's having to pull several different resources to inform and also translate his work and his own identity as the artist while reflecting those needs of the author. This is where you really see the lines blur between visual literacy and more traditional literacy. He describes for himself the process that he has to go through in order to bring both of those literacies together.
Yeah. So when it comes to like the meaning from words and whatnot, usually whenever I get a manuscript, if I've looked it over and I've agreed to it, I'm looking it over, and the first thing that I'll usually do is I will underline various sentences or adjectives that kind of jump out at me, like, "Ooh, this would be really great to illustrate," or "There's a." I like to think of illustration as a way of kind of drawing what the text doesn't tell us. So, especially with children's literature, it's like, it was a beautiful fall day. All of the things that, we don't think about with a beautiful fall day, like what was the weather like? Is the sun shining? Is the wind blowing? Are there leaves falling? What kind of leaves? Where are we? Trying to, the more that I get to kind of show what the author is doing, but not saying. Those are moments that I look for. I also look for those adjectives of like, oh, this is going to be a really tense moment, and then we're going to have a resolution of sorts. So I'm thinking of it not so much in a sense of, is this a good story? I mean, I'm looking at that a little bit, but more so just, how is this going to play out visually? And so I'm often thinking in panels of sorts, almost like a storyboard, or I'm looking for moments where there is what I call a page turning moment, because I'd like to think of a book where it's, nothing is forcing a child to sit and read the book or forcing the adult to sit and read the book to the child. There should be something that compels them to want to turn the page. And so I look for those moments of, oh, we need to take this word and it needs to be the last word on the page because that is a almost like a cliffhanger moment.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I'm thinking about visual pacing. I'm thinking about just the overall arrangement. I'm thinking of various visual styles. So I'm calling upon almost like a Rolodex of visuals uh, from various illustrators in art history to kind of think like, ooh, this has a very Mary Blair vibe, or this has an Art Spiegelman kind of vibe, or this story reads like a Miss Frizzle book, or you know. So that's really what I'm going through when I'm reading those things.
His process of creation interpretation is obviously highly layered. He has to reconcile the visual requirements for what he's trying to communicate as the artist while also navigating the digital tools that he uses that makes it easier for him to create, but also takes away some of the physical aspects of his artwork in order to create a story that aligns with the expectations of the author. All of that he is attempting to do while also trying to breathe life into these stories, which I think is where art adds a layer or has something as far as the literacy that we see with it that we don't see in traditional literacy. There is a realness and a life that exists within art that you can't necessarily recreate or translate through maybe the written word.
Digital work to me oftentimes feels lifeless or flat just because there doesn't seem to be that tactile aspect to it. Um, And so that's another challenge that I like of trying to make things that are digital or created digitally, but they look as though they were made with traditional media. So I'm looking at various types of brushes and trying to recreate the sense of whatever media I'm kind of choosing to work within it. So if it's going to be more watercolor, I really try to make it look as though this was painted with physical paper and water, or if it's more of a like a wood block print or a linocut print, making it seem like it has those little divots that would be missing from uneven ink application. Trying to bring those little things that cue us into whether something is digital or physical, and bringing those physical visual cues into the digital world.
What I found as I talked with Mr. Hale is that while it might be challenging to bring life into a digital art media, there is a depth of understanding that can be achieved through art that written literacy doesn't seem to be able to communicate. Even a single element can bring a greater sense of meaning, and he discusses these affordances of visual literacy.
When it comes to the affordances, uh, I rely a whole lot on color. And I think that is a very, very big thing. As humans, uh, we are very visual people, and we do a lot of interpretation with color. If something is red, we see it as either dangerous or loving and sensual. If something is blue, we see it as either very depressing or it's very lighthearted. Uh, so I think with those affordances, I things like color and texture, those are really big for uh, for communicating ideas. And then, of course, everything does communicate meaning, whether we want it to or not. I mean, as humans, we apply meaning to everything, and knowing that it makes me more cautious, or not cautious, but more deliberate in the decisions that I make, where I put a line, how thick that line is, even what angle that line is going at, or take those and apply them to any element such as color. How intense, how much, is it even, is it splotchy, how splotchy is it, or how uneven is it?
The fact that we attribute so much meaning to things we're able to observe is both beneficial and challenging. A more in depth and vast sense of meaning can be ingrained in visual literacy, but there's also the challenge of understanding that different backgrounds inform what we take away from something. This is a challenge he has to navigate as he reconciles the author's thoughts, visions, ideas with his own knowledge, his own background, and his own artistic style. Art is something that is definitely in the eye of the beholder, but you want to ensure that a unanimous general understanding is taken away from it. But in reality, this is not an easy task. His process, and he mentioned this, is very detailed. He is constantly editing, revising, storyboarding, fine tuning, going back and forth with the author constantly. Ultimately, an artist's work is never done, but there is a point that you have to reach where you feel confident that the message you're trying to deliver is visually understood by your viewer.
What I would say is when it's working is if I can flip through the images, and or if I can have like my husband or a coworker or somebody, flip through the pages and not, or not pages, the images, I should say, uh, without the text, not knowing the story, and give me a rough sense of what the story is. Because when I took illustration at the University of Arkansas, which it was more like visual communication. We had this philosophy that we had created as a class where a an illustration is stronger than the text by itself, but it is not a replacement for the text. And so essentially, it's kind of that, like, without the text, the story can still be told, but obviously it is not, it can't fully replace the text itself. Um, and so that's what we meant, like when we say it was stronger. Like, it's not, again, it's not a full replacement, but there are things that you just can't talk about in a text. Like, you can say the color chartreuse, but chartreuse is going to be different for everybody, versus when here's this image, most of us are seeing the same thing.
I think what he mentions here is super interesting, that the illustration is stronger than the text, but not a replacement. This is something I had to really think about and kind of consider. So, to better frame it for myself, I had to think about this in relation to like my own kids or students. There's moments where no matter how I explain a concept, it just doesn't seem to resonate with my kids or bring them to a solid understanding or foundation. So, take like tone, for example. I can define it, explain it, provide examples of it, but they still struggle with it, whether it be identifying, understanding, or explaining. However, I can use visual language to reframe it in a way that is much more accessible. And I can better pinpoint where their understandings may lie. That doesn't negate the importance of identifying and being able to explain and being able to define it, but it brings a new perspective that I'm not able to verbally or in a written format or through traditional literacy can communicate in a way that my students understand it and provide them with a solid foundation. But what I find most interesting about visual literacy is that obviously it can stand on its own. We see that kind of through our daily lives, and we have that understanding that art in itself is its own thing. But there is definitely very strong overlap between written literacy and visual literacy.
I would say where it really blurs, and it's very much a Venn diagram, is that reading of visual imagery. It's that, I'm wanting this scene to become, or this scene to read as happy, or to read a certain way, and do all of the visuals here, do they allude to that? Do they mix together in the right way where I'm being true to the text, and it's doing what I need it to do. And it's not confusing, it's not too busy, it's not too bland, it's very well balanced. It's almost like making a soup in a way, like there's all those components that go into a good stew or a soup, and then that final bit of like, oh, I need a little more rosemary, or we need some more broth, there's too much salt, add in some potatoes to take out the salt. It's that kind of balancing act. And so that's where I would say where it really begins to blur, is where you're not just looking, you're observing again. It goes back to that kind of stepping out and away from it as much as I can, to a degree.
Mr. Hale also brings in a unique perspective because obviously he can view literacy from multiple angles, being an illustrator and an educator. So I think what's important when trying to find ways to expose our students to different forms of literacy, that we not get too hung up on the literacy itself, being experts on that, because obviously, like, I'm not an expert in illustration, but we can focus a lot more on the mindset and provide students with opportunities to bring in their own literacies instead of trying to force our own or our limited knowledge of other literacies on them.
I would say, in terms of mindset, it really is. I love that you use the word mindset because that's what you want to develop. It's something I even try to develop in my students. Told them, like, I don't necessarily care about your skills because your drawing skills, those get better with more and more time and practice. What I'm more interested is those mindsets. So things like observation, not just looking at an object or a scene or something and assuming that you know what it is, like truly looking at it and engaging with it, looking at it for more than just 10 seconds. If you look at something for more than 10 seconds, there's going to be things that, you probably knew they were there, but now they stand out to you in a different way and they capture your attention in a different way. Um, and then there's the idea of iteration and revision. Don't just go with your first idea, go with your 10th idea. And I tell students that with the metaphor of, how do you know what your favorite restaurant is? Oh, because you've eaten at other restaurants like that one or serve a similar food, and they don't match up. You've learned through failures or bad experiences with a restaurant that, oh yeah, Sonic is superior to the McDonald's and Whataburger, whatever your preference is.
I think ultimately is the mindset and approach that is used with visual literacy that is going to have significant impacts on school literacy learning. As he mentioned, we should try to move our students away from going with their first idea and really sit with their thoughts, go deeper into their thinking. It's allowing students to examine and reconsider what it is that they're encountering that is going to be the most beneficial to our kids. We're trying to encourage critical thinking, but that is something that occurs through trials and failure. That is something that visual literacy seems to be better at than traditional, more rigid literacy. I think all of that starts with providing our students with low stake opportunities to hash out a concept and build their understanding through exercises. He mentioned an activity that I'm actually going to implement in my own classroom that he does with his kids, where he uses the Google Labs platform and has students describe an AI image in enough detail that the computer can reproduce a similar match. And as the levels increase, the accuracy of the description must as well. That is something that would be extremely easy to integrate in a classroom as an exercise for narrative or descriptive writing that challenges the students but also allows them to refine their skills. We must also integrate activities that encourage our students to look at a problem or concept from a different perspective. We're comfortable with traditional or mainstream answers, so we fall into the habit of trying to get students to follow a specific way of thinking rather than bringing in their own backgrounds and perspectives and looking at it from a totally different angle. Like most educators, I don't want my students to fall into a single line of thought. I want to empower them to think critically and bring solutions and new ideas. I believe visual literacy provides the flexibility and permission to do so that traditional literacy seems to discourage. I know that there will never be a one size fits all answer to education, but as I have grown this semester and considering what I've learned with Mr. Hale, I think the integration of visual literacy is going to be a step in the right direction. Our expectations and approach to visual literacy is what allows us to look at a piece and feel the freedom to interpret it and even challenge it in a way that with written literacy we don't seem to have. I think there's a lot from this form of literacy that we can learn from. Well, as this episode kind of comes to a close, I just want to thank Mr. Hale again for taking the time to talk with me. I absolutely wish y'all could hear the entirety of our interview. It was almost like 2 hours, and there was so much that I got out of it and that I will be 100% implementing into my own classroom. But I also want to thank y'all for learning with me today. So have a good one and tell the kids that I said hi.